Greetings everyone and welcome to Fireside History. In today's episode, we delve into one of the most extreme scenarios of modern warfare. Imagine for a moment the winter of 1950 in the frozen mountains of North Korea. Around 15,000 Marines advance, confident of a quick victory. But what they find is a trap. Out of nowhere, 120,000 Chinese soldiers completely surround them. The cold becomes yet another weapon, with temperatures dropping to minus 37 degrees. What chances of survival exist in such a hell? Let's begin with today's story. To understand how that inferno of ice came to be, we must travel back in time. Just a few months earlier, in the autumn of 1950, the mood was not one of despair. It was one of almost delirious euphoria. The war, which had begun in June, started as an absolute disaster for the United Nations forces. The North Korean army, well-trained and equipped, had swept across almost the entire peninsula. The defenders were cornered in a small perimeter around the city of Pusan, with the sea at their backs. Defeat seemed inevitable. But then General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the UN forces, proposed a plan. It was not just a daring plan, it was an all-or-nothing gamble. He wanted to carry out a massive, amphibious landing at Incheon, a port with treacherous tides and formidable defenses, far behind enemy lines. His own officers thought it was madness. However, in September 1950, the gamble paid off. The landing was a spectacular success. It caught the North Koreans completely by surprise, cutting their supply lines and trapping their main army. Suddenly, the course of the war turned 180 degrees. UN forces broke the Pusan perimeter and began a relentless pursuit northward. Imagine the scene. Columns of tanks and soldiers advanced on roads where, weeks earlier, they had fled in disarray. The North Korean army disintegrated in their path. The capital, Seoul, was recaptured. Victory seemed total. Morale was so high that the phrase "we'll be home by Christmas" became the general sentiment. The UN's original mandate was simply to restore the border. But with such a crushing victory, MacArthur saw a greater opportunity. He convinced Washington to pursue the enemy into their own territory, cross the 38th parallel, and unify all of Korea. The ultimate goal was to reach the Yalu River, the border with China. This blind confidence was the seed of disaster. Military intelligence ignored the warnings. Reports of troop movements across the border were dismissed. Why would they worry about China? The war was won. No one saw the punch that was about to land. As euphoria gripped the high command, a very clear warning arrived from Beijing. Through diplomatic channels, China warned that it would not tolerate the presence of enemy troops on its border. If UN forces approached the Yalu River, they would intervene. But for Douglas MacArthur, these threats sounded like a simple bluff. In his mind, China, fresh out of a civil war, was a paper tiger. He believed it was incapable of facing American military might. He completely dismissed intelligence reports speaking of thousands of Chinese soldiers crossing the Yalu by night. He considered them exaggerations, or in the worst case, mere volunteers of no real importance. With this blind confidence, MacArthur ordered the final offensive to end the war. But he made a colossal strategic error. He divided his army into two completely separate commands. One force would advance along the west coast. Meanwhile, a second Army Corps, which included the 1st Marine Division, would do so from the east. This decision was a disaster foretold. The rugged and impassable Taibak Mountains separated both forces. A gap of more than 80 kilometers was created between them, a perfect terrain for an ambush. There was no possibility of mutual support. They were, in practice, two armies fighting in two different wars, totally isolated from one another. The 1st Marine Division was ordered to march north, penetrating deep into the heart of those icy mountains. Their objective was a remote and difficult-to-access area, the Chosin Reservoir. Imagine these men, advancing along a single winding road, surrounded by snow-covered peaks and absolute silence. They marched directly into the jaws of a trap. They did not know that an entire army was waiting for them in the shadows. That army waiting in the shadows had a name. It was the 9th Army Group of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, a massive force. According to sources from the time, it was composed of 12 divisions, totaling about 120,000 men. Commanding it was General Funchilin, a veteran hardened by the Long March and the Civil War. His mission was brutally simple: enter North Korea, surround the 1st Marine Division, and annihilate it completely. It was a direct order from Mao Zedong. To achieve this, surprise was fundamental. For weeks, this immense army moved like ghosts. They crossed the Yalu River from Manchuria under the cover of night, marching in the freezing darkness. During the day, they hid in forests and valleys, motionless and perfectly camouflaged. American reconnaissance planes saw absolutely nothing. Imagine the discipline required for something like that. Thousands of men advancing in silence, enduring a cold for which they were unprepared. And this is where the story of this formidable army becomes tragic. They were elite soldiers, veterans who had defeated Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces. Their morale was high and their courage unquestionable. They had a terrible Achilles heel. The 9th Army had been recruited in the subtropical climate of southern China. They were sent into battle with such haste that they did not receive winter equipment. Most wore thin cotton uniforms and canvas shoes. They had no gloves, no thermal underwear, nor adequate sleeping bags. Their food consisted of frozen potatoes that they had to warm on their bodies to be able to bite them. They lacked heavy artillery, air support, and functional logistics. What weapon did they have left then? Their only advantages were the element of surprise, impeccable camouflage, and overwhelming numerical superiority. With that, and with an iron determination, they prepared to launch themselves upon the Marines. Imagine for a moment the landscape of the Chosin Reservoir. It is not a battlefield in the usual sense. It is a labyrinth of sharp peaks and deep valleys, part of the formidable Taebaek mountain range, a place where nature itself seems hostile to human beings. In this brutal terrain, there was only one passable route, a narrow and precarious road that snaked through the gorges. For the Marines, this was their only lifeline, their main supply route. It was the only way to advance, and if things went wrong, the only way to retreat. An exposed jugular vein in the middle of a wild territory. And then, as if the terrain wasn't enemy enough, the sky decided to join the party. In late November 1950, a Siberian weather front descended upon the Korean peninsula. It was not a simple cold snap. It was a declaration of war by winter. Temperatures plummeted to minus 37 degrees Celsius. With a biting mountain wind, the wind chill was even lower. A cold that the human body simply is not designed to withstand. This extreme cold became an active and merciless adversary. The metal of weapons became so brittle that it could break with a single blow. The oil in vehicles and machine guns froze, rendering them useless. Radio batteries died, cutting off communications. The ground hardened like concrete, making it impossible to dig trenches for protection. But the most terrible impact was on the men themselves. Frostbite became a threat as real as enemy bullets. Food rations turned into bricks of ice impossible to bite. Morphine syringes for the wounded froze. Bags of blood plasma solidified, becoming useless. In this frozen hell, every soldier, both American and Chinese, fought a personal battle for survival even before the first shot was fired. The battlefield was prepared, and it was not neutral. It was on the side of death. The spearhead of this reckless advance was the 1st Marine Division. This was no ordinary unit. They were the heirs to a tradition forged in the hells of the Pacific, in places like Guadalcanal and Okinawa, an elite force with a legendary reputation for tenacity. Commanding these men was Major General Oliver P. Smith. And if the high command in Tokyo lived in a bubble of optimism, Smith had his feet firmly anchored in the icy reality. He was a methodical, calm, and, above all, deeply skeptical man. He did not trust the intelligence reports that downplayed the Chinese threat. His veteran's instincts screamed at him that something didn't add up. While his superiors urged him to advance faster to end the war, Smith did something that enraged the command. He disobeyed the spirit of the orders. Instead of launching into a blind race north, he ordered his engineers to do something unusual in a lightning offensive: build. As his regiments, the 5th, 7th, and 1st Marines, pushed deeper into the territory, they left a trail of preparations. They built well-stocked supply depots at key points along that single precarious road. And most importantly of all, they erected 2 rudimentary landing strips in the middle of nowhere. One in the small village of Hagaru-ri, at the base of the reservoir, and another further south, in Kotori. They were frozen dirt runways, barely sufficient for transport planes. Why waste precious time on this? Because Smith understood something his superiors ignored. The only road leading them forward was also the only one that could bring them back. If that route was cut off, those airstrips would be their only connection to the outside world. This caution, this silent disobedience, would be the most decisive factor of all. Smith was not building bases for the final attack. He was building the bases for survival. On the night of November 27, 1950, the silence in the mountains was almost supernatural. A dense, heavy silence, amplified by the snow that absorbed everything. The Marines of the 5th and 7th Regiments, camped in their frozen positions around Untitled, were trying to shield themselves from a cold that seemed to have a life of its own. They had no idea that thousands of eyes were watching them from the dark ridges surrounding them. Suddenly, the night exploded in a cacophonous roar. The silence was replaced by a chilling sound that froze the blood more than the Siberian wind itself. It was the penetrating blare of bugles and the sharp, constant whistle of horns. That was the Chinese attack signal, a psychological weapon designed to sow panic. From all the hillsides, like an unstoppable tide rising from the earth, thousands of figures dressed in padded cotton uniforms surged down the hill. These were not disorganized attacks. They were perfectly coordinated human waves. The Chinese soldiers moved with ghostly discipline to overwhelm the defenses by sheer mass and speed. They infiltrated among the rocks and trees, appearing out of nowhere in the darkness to attack the flanks and rear. The attacks were not only focused on Untitled. Simultaneously, other Chinese forces struck the rear positions at Hagaru-ri. East of the reservoir, U.S. Army units were also overwhelmed by the assault. Within hours, the reality of the war was completely reversed. The 1st Marine Division was no longer on the offensive. It was fragmented, with its units isolated and completely surrounded. It is estimated that 8 Chinese divisions had descended upon them. The road, that single vital lifeline that Smith had worked so hard to protect, was cut in multiple places. The advance toward the Yalu River had ended abruptly. Now only one word remained in everyone's mind: survive. While the Marines at Untitled fought for their lives, across the frozen reservoir, an even greater tragedy was unfolding. A story often forgotten, but one that sealed the fate of thousands. There, on the eastern shore, was a U.S. Army unit. It was the 31st Regimental Combat Team, known as Task Force McLean. Approximately 3,000 men, mostly Army soldiers, not Marines, who were protecting the right flank of the entire advance. They were even more isolated, more exposed. When the Chinese offensive erupted, they were not hit by one or two divisions. They were the primary target of 3 full Chinese divisions. The weight of nearly 30,000 men fell upon them in an avalanche of coordinated violence. The assaults were relentless, coming from all directions. Within days, Task Force McLean ceased to exist as a cohesive fighting unit. Its commander, Colonel McLean, was wounded and captured, dying shortly thereafter. Command passed to Lieutenant Colonel Don Faith, but the situation was untenable. The organized retreat turned into a desperate rout across the icy terrain. The soldiers fought in small groups, without communication and with ammunition running out. The valley through which they tried to escape became a death corridor. History would remember it as the Hellfire Valley. Of the 3,000 men comprising the force, only a few hundred managed to reach the Marine lines at Hagaru-ri. They arrived like specters, many of them wounded, frozen, and traumatized. They brought with them the terrible news of their unit's total annihilation. For General Smith and his Marines, surrounded and outnumbered, the story of these men was not simply a casualty report. It was a prophecy. It was a clear vision of what would happen to them if they failed to break through and escape the trap. With the annihilation of Task Force McLean, the Marines understood that they were fighting against a relentless enemy. But there was another adversary at Chosin, one that wore no uniform, played no bugles, and attacked everyone equally. It was the cold itself, transformed into the most effective weapon of the battle. At -37 degrees, human technology simply gives up. The steel of the M1 Garand rifles became brittle and broke. The lubricating oil of the bar machine guns turned into a thick sludge that blocked the mechanisms. The soldiers discovered a desperate and unpleasant solution. Urine, being warm, could thaw a bolt long enough to fire a few bursts. The crisis was even worse for the medics. Imagine trying to save a man screaming in pain, looking for a morphine syringe, and discovering that the liquid inside was a cylinder of solid ice. The medics had to put the ampoules in their mouths, using their own body heat to thaw the painkiller while their patient waited. Blood plasma bags, vital for transfusions, froze into useless blocks of reddish ice. But the most personal and silent threat was frostbite. It was not a simple nuisance. It was a wound of war. Toes swelled inside boots, losing all sensation before turning black and dead. Men removed their gloves for only a few seconds to handle their equipment, and their fingers turned white and stiff as wax. The cold devoured flesh silently. It is estimated that more than 5,000 men suffered severe frostbite injuries. For many, it was a sentence of amputation. Cold was an indiscriminate enemy that caused massive casualties on both sides, a silent killer in that frozen hell. For the 8,000 Marines trapped in Udamni, the world had shrunk to a single point on the map, an unnamed hill overlooking a gorge known as Toktong Pass. That pass was not an option. It was the only way out. If it fell, the trap would close forever, and the entire division would be annihilated. Keeping that door open was the mission of a single company, Fox Company, 7th Marine Regiment. Barely 240 men under the command of Captain William Barber. Their job was to take that hill and not let go under any circumstances. What Barber and his men didn't know was that the Chinese army had assigned them a welcome committee, an entire regiment with an estimated force of several thousand soldiers. The Chinese mission was identical, but in reverse, to take the hill and close the door. For 5 nights and 4 days, Fox Company fought one of the war's most desperate battles. Imagine the scene: a smaller island of resistance in a sea of attackers. Chinese waves launched against their positions again and again, under cover of darkness and snowstorms. The fight became a brutal, close-quarters affair. It was often fought with bayonets and hand grenades, in a chaos of screams and explosions. Wounded Marines refused to be evacuated, knowing that every rifle counted. Captain Barber himself was shot in the leg but continued to direct the defense, leaning on his men. The cost was terrible. Fox Company suffered over 50% casualties. Few men remained standing, frozen, exhausted, and almost out of ammunition, but they did not yield. Their incredible resistance kept Tok Tong Pass open. Thanks to them, the rest of the division would have a chance. They had an escape route. For the men fighting on the ground, the situation was untenable. They were surrounded and outnumbered. Worse still, the cut road meant their heavy artillery was useless or had been left behind. How can an entire army be stopped without cannons? The answer was not on the ground, but in the sky. They had a guardian angel, a noisy angel with folded wings and a 2,000 horsepower engine. It was the Vought Eforu Corsair fighter. For the Marines, the characteristic whistling sound of its engine as it passed was the most beautiful sound in the world. For the Chinese forces, it was the harbinger of a fiery death. Close air support became the Marines' mobile artillery. Navy squadron pilots flew hundreds of missions in impossible conditions. Imagine the skill and courage required to fly a fighter at high speed through narrow, treacherous mountain valleys, with peaks on both sides and terrible weather. They descended so low that the Marines on the ground could see their faces. They dropped their payloads with surgical precision, sometimes just a few meters from friendly positions. Napalm turned the icy slopes, full of camouflaged Chinese soldiers, into an inferno of fire and black smoke. The snowy hills burned. Their rockets and machine gun fire swept away waves of attackers before they could reach American lines. They broke the concentration of Chinese troops, disorganized their assaults, and gave the infantry vital breathing room to move and defend themselves. The psychological impact was immense. For the Marines, every pass by a Corsair was a morale boost, proof that they were not alone. For the Chinese army, which lacked any kind of air support, it was a constant, invisible terror that could strike at any moment. This air superiority was the great equalizer at Chosin. It did not win the battle by itself, but it prevented it from being a total massacre. A small aside. If you are enjoying this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. You will help us a lot to continue making more content like this. Truly, even though it's a simple click, it's the motivation we have to continue sharing history. Thank you. The news of the encirclement reached the outside world like a hammer blow. From high command in Tokyo to newspapers in the United States, the situation was seen as an unmitigated disaster. For any observer, the only word that described what was happening was retreat. A war correspondent, seasoned in 1,000 battles, approached General Oliver P. Smith amidst the chaos. He asked him the question everyone was asking. He asked him about his plans for the division's imminent retreat. Smith's reply would go down in the history of the Marine Corps. With a calm that defied the catastrophe surrounding him, the general looked at him and uttered an immortal phrase. "Retreat, hell. We're not retreating. We're just attacking in a different direction." That wasn't mere bravado to keep morale high for the press. It was a declaration of intent, a combat order that changed the mindset of every man. For Smith and his Marines, the word retreat implied panic and disorganization. It meant abandoning equipment and the wounded. It meant becoming the army unit that had been annihilated on the eastern shore of the reservoir. And that, simply, was not going to happen. The plan was methodical and brutally clear. The first priority was to evacuate the wounded and recover the dead. True to their motto, they would leave no one behind. The second, to save all possible equipment. Tanks, artillery, and trucks would leave with them or be destroyed. And the third priority, perhaps the most important of all, was to destroy any enemy unit that stood in their way to the sea. They were not going to slip away through the Chinese lines. They were going to fight their way through, battling every meter of the journey. It was not a flight to save their lives. It was an offensive operation in the opposite direction, a demonstration of discipline and firepower in the worst imaginable circumstances. They were trapped, yes, but now the enemy was also trapped with them. The order had been given to attack in another direction. The objective was to reach the Hagaru-ri base, the division's headquarters. On the map, the distance was almost ridiculous, barely 22 kilometers. A car ride. But in that frozen hell, every meter of that single road would be bought with blood. The column set off. It was not a retreat. It was a moving combat hedgehog. A long snake of trucks, artillery vehicles, and thousands of men on foot. The healthy Marines walked along the flanks, their gaze fixed on the hilltops. They knew that from there, thousands of eyes were watching them. And the attacks came. It wasn't a major battle, but thousands of small, vicious ambushes. A constant trickle of mortar and machine gun fire from the heights. The road became a death corridor, a 22-kilometer-long gauntlet from which there was no escape. The advance was agonizingly slow, less than a kilometer per hour. The column would advance a few meters and stop abruptly. A machine gun nest would open fire from a ridge, immobilizing everyone. Then the ritual would begin. A platoon of Marines had to separate from the main group. They had to scale the frozen hill under intense fire, destroy the enemy position, and come back down. Only then would the column crawl a few more meters before the cycle repeated itself again and again. They fought for every curve, for every bridge, and for every gorge. The sound of Corsair fighters was their only constant artillery, sweeping the slopes with napalm and rockets. But on the ground, it was the men with their rifles who paid the price. It took them 79 hours to cover those 22 kilometers. 3 days and 3 nights of uninterrupted combat, just to reach the first safe point. And this was barely the beginning. When the exhausted survivors from Udam-ni arrived at Hagaru-ri, they did not find a simple camp. They found a fortress. General Smith's foresight, his insistence on building supply depots in a landing strip, proved to be a stroke of genius. Hagaru-ri was now the heart that pumped life into the entire division. A well-established defensive perimeter surrounded the base, but the true miracle was at its center. An icy dirt runway, hastily built by engineers under sporadic enemy fire. On that strip of ice and mud, the Marines' guardian angels would land, the C-47 Skytrain transport planes. Imagine the scene. The planes spiraled down to avoid anti-aircraft fire. They landed on a precarious runway while fighting raged just a few kilometers away. Ground crews worked with feverish urgency. Every arriving plane was a double blessing. Their cargo holds open to unload the supplies that kept the fight alive. They brought ammunition for nearly depleted rifles and combat rations for empty stomachs. Also arriving were batteries for radios, and most importantly, plasma and bandages for the wounded. Then, in a matter of minutes, the transformation occurred. Men with severe frostbite, with bullet and shrapnel wounds, were carefully loaded aboard. These were the men who otherwise would have died in the cold. The plane took off again, carrying away the wounded and making space for hope. In a heroic airlift that defied the weather and the enemy, 4,312 men were evacuated. This act had an incalculable psychological impact. Every Marine, from private to officer, they knew one thing with absolute certainty. No matter what happened, no matter how desperate the fight, they were not going to be abandoned. After the evacuation of the wounded, the division consolidated in Hagaru-ri. They were no longer isolated regiments. They were a single massive combat column, a serpent of steel and men that stretched for miles. Engineers, support personnel, artillery, and thousands of infantry prepared for the next leg of the journey, 18 kilometers to the Hagaru-ri base. On paper, a short distance. In reality, the most dangerous stretch of the entire road. Imagine the scene of that departure. The column set out with agonizing slowness. Every vehicle was precious. Every man, an indispensable rifle. But now they carried a burden that weighed more than any equipment or ammunition. They carried their dead. The ground, hard as granite from the extreme cold, made it impossible to dig graves. True to their promise of leaving no one behind, the Marines found a solution as practical as it was bleak. The bodies of their fallen comrades, frozen in the postures in which they died, were tied to the fenders of the jeeps and the hoods of the trucks. This somber procession advanced under the constant gaze of the enemy. The hills on both sides of the road swarmed with Chinese soldiers. The attacks did not cease. They were not massive assaults like those at Untitled, but a constant and sadistic harassment. An incessant fire of mortars and machine guns rained down on the column, seeking to wear it down, to bleed it dry little by little. Every turn of the road was a new ambush. Every broken-down vehicle became an obstacle that blocked thousands of men under enemy fire. The able-bodied Marines had to jump from the trucks to repel the attacks, fight in the snow, and get back in to advance a few more meters. It was a funeral march, and at the same time a pitched battle in motion. Hell now moved with them. After reaching Hagaru-ri, the division faced the last leg of its odyssey. The port of Hungnam, Salvation, was only a few kilometers away, but the Chinese army had prepared one last brilliant trap. One that, in theory, was insurmountable. The obstacle was a gorge known as Funchilin Pass. At that point, the road had to cross a deep chasm over a concrete bridge. Chinese engineers had blown up a key section, creating a gap impossible to traverse. The entire division, with its tanks and trucks, was paralyzed. For the Chinese commanders, this was the ultimate checkmate, the perfect trap. The Marines were trapped between the chasm and the divisions pursuing them. It was only a matter of time. But military history is full of moments when necessity becomes the mother of audacity. If they couldn't build a bridge, they would bring it from the sky. The plan was so desperate it bordered on madness. Imagine the scene. Enormous C-119 flying boxcar transport planes rumbling over the snow-capped peaks. From their cargo bays, 8 gigantic sections of an M2 pontoon bridge were dropped. Each multi-ton piece slowly descended under the canopy of a gigantic parachute. The task then fell to the combat engineers. Amid a cold that made steel crack, and under constant sniper fire, they began to assemble the miracle. With numb fingers, they guided the heavy steel sections into place, building the piers with whatever they had at hand. In just 2 days of uninterrupted work, the impossible became reality. A path of steel stretched across the chasm. The first tank crossed with a metallic roar that echoed throughout the valley. The final trap had not only been avoided, it had been humiliated. The path to the sea was at last clear. Arriving at the port of Hungnam was not the end of the battle. It was the beginning of a logistical miracle. After the Odyssey of the Mountains, the sight of an immense fleet anchored in the sea was almost unreal. The struggle for survival had ended. Now the struggle against time began. The plan was to evacuate the entire 10th Army Corps by sea. The scale of the operation was gigantic. It involved rescuing 105,000 American and South Korean soldiers, along with more than 17,000 vehicles and hundreds of thousands of tons of material. An entire city on the move, fleeing by sea. But upon reaching the docks, the soldiers encountered a challenge not listed in any military manual. A human tide of desperate North Korean civilians crowded every square meter of the port. It is estimated there were around 98,000 people. They were entire families who had abandoned everything to flee the advance of communist forces. They saw in that foreign fleet their only and last chance to escape. Their faces reflected a terror that the Marines knew very well. They pleaded, with gestures and tears, for a space on the ships. Amidst the chaos of a military evacuation, a deeply human decision was made. They would not be left behind. The priority was no longer just to save an army. It was also to save a people. From December the 11th, the docks became a hive of controlled activity. Men, tanks, trucks, and now thousands of refugees were loaded into the holds of nearly 200 ships. The operation culminated on December the 24th, when the last ship sailed on Christmas Eve. Combat engineers blew up the port, leaving behind only ruins and smoke. The attack in another direction had ended. They not only saved a division, they rescued the future of thousands of innocents. When the last ship sailed from Hungnam, the battle ended with silence. A heavy silence filled with the echo of the struggle. The time came to take stock, to count the true cost of that frozen hell. For the 1st Marine Division, the numbers were brutal. They suffered 4,418 combat casualties, of which 718 were fatal. But a silent enemy was even more devastating. More than 7,300 Marines were evacuated due to severe frostbite injuries. The cold had caused nearly twice as many casualties as the Chinese army itself. If the price for the Americans was terrible, the cost for the Chinese Ninth Army was a human catastrophe. Exact figures do not exist. Historians estimate their casualties between 40,000 and 80,000 men. It was an entire army shattered by a lethal combination of enemy fire and relentless cold for which they were unprepared. In purely tactical terms, the Chinese achieved their objective. They expelled UN forces from North Korea. But it was a Pyrrhic victory, one that cost them almost as much as a defeat. 2 of their divisions were so decimated that they were withdrawn from the front. They would not fight again for the rest of the war. The Ninth Army, as an effective force, ceased to exist for months. The Marines had not been annihilated as their enemies had been ordered. They had survived. In their fight for survival, they functionally destroyed an entire army group. It was not a retreat. It was the confirmation of General Smith's phrase, an attack that, strategically, gave them a victory much more important than the possession of a piece of frozen land. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir did not end at the docks of Hungnam. For the men who lived through it, it never truly ended. Its story entered almost immediately into the legend of the Marine Corps, not as just another battle, but as its most defining chapter of resistance. These survivors are known today as the Chosin Few. It is a title not earned in parades, but in hell. To be one of them means having looked annihilation in the eye. It means having been surrounded, outnumbered, and frozen to the bone, and yet still having decided to keep fighting. We can learn much from that struggle. What lesson did that struggle leave us? It taught us the vital importance of leadership that does not succumb to panic. A calm leadership that prepares for survival while others only see victory. That calm spread, forging a steel morale that refused to break. It also forever demonstrated the value of close air support. The Corsair fighters were not just a weapon. They were the artillery, the hope, and the proof that they were not alone. And logistics, often forgotten, revealed itself as the true god of war. Without the landing strips and airlifts, the story would have been very different. That is why the legacy of Chosin goes beyond military tactics. It is a universal symbol of the tenacity of the human spirit. It is proof that the discipline and cohesion of a unit can confront the impossible and win. It is not just about surviving, it is about prevailing. The legend of those men is not measured by the ground they took. It is measured by the will they demonstrated in the most inhospitable place on the planet. An iron will that allowed them to do what no one believed possible. To attack, always, in another direction, and to carry their wounded and their dead with them. Thank you for joining us on this journey to the frozen hell of the Chosin Reservoir. The story of the Marines who fought there is an unforgettable testament to human tenacity that deserves to be remembered. Their struggle redefines the limits of endurance. We hope that you found this documentary informative. If you want to discover more stories like this, please consider subscribing to our channel so you don't miss future episodes. Your support is essential for us to continue with our work. See you soon.